A lot to cover today. Exciting things going on in the economy. Not everyone gets as excited about this sort of thing as I do, but we do. I'll try to talk fast and keep it simplified so that none of you fall asleep on your Zoom call. It's a little cloudy here in Helena, so easy to fall asleep. This slide shows Montana and the US real GDP index to the pre-recession level. Now, basically, we do indexing because it allows us to put the pre-recession level as 100%. And then it shows how far we fell in percentage terms. And then it's how quickly we came back up to that 100% level. And really, we can put the US and Montana on the same chart. So that's why we do this indexing, so we can look at that percentage change all on one chart. I like to explain that to everyone, just so you know. I will be giving a quiz at the end of what indexing is. So I hope you paid attention to that. But there's a lot of charts indexed in here, so I want to take the time to explain it. So the point of this chart is that GDP measures the overall production in the economy and how much goods and services our businesses and workers are producing. Both the US and Montana came out of the recession in terms of GDP in the same quarter in Q1. So basically, we're at full recovery in terms of production. Looking at the labor market, most of the data indicates that it's been a little longer time until we've gotten a full recovery. This chart looks at September data, and we're looking at February as our pre-recession point. The payroll jobs number dropped down the most. That's normal. Total employment includes self-employed, which tends to be a little bit less volatile during recession. So that's why payroll fell a lot more. However, we had a very, very strong recovery coming out of the recession in terms of job growth. And now, in the most recent month, we are at over 100% for employment. In fact, employment has never been higher in the state of Montana. So over where we were prior to the pandemic, and everyone is back and employed. Our payroll job number is still a little bit down, but I will say we also get another data source on payroll jobs that's more accurate, that comes from our UI reporting, and that's indicating that we are actually already above the payroll jobs number. So there's a difference in the two different data sets there. We'll learn more as we get more data. And then the labor force is the other thing I wanted to talk to you, and we will spend a lot of time on today. The labor force refers to everybody who is either working or looking for work. So that's the available worker pool. We are currently at 99.8%, still down a few workers. So I'm sure we'll get back up in the next couple of months. The labor force has been a pretty big issue as we've exited the recession, because we've had this very, very strong job growth, but many of our workers are still facing challenges with the COVID crisis. And we also have had a worker shortage for a long time because of our population demographics. So it's kind of come to a crux in the current tight labor market, which all of you have heard about, I know. And also I want to point out that at the very bottom here, there's that job tracking dashboard. That is on our LMI site, and all of you guys can check this out, and you will get every single month. This will be updated for you. There's also a lot of county data. You'll see a lot of that today. So I just want to point that out. Also want to mention today that Montana is doing better than the rest of the nation in terms of our employment recovery. We're 11th best in the nation for total employment and 4th best for payroll employment. And that's before we've even accounted for the fact that the other data sources showing that we might be even further ahead than we initially thought. Looking at performance within the state of Montana, the western counties, and particularly the urban counties, have done a lot better exiting the recession. A lot of that is because the types of jobs that were harmed during the recession include a lot of retail and food service jobs. Those tend to be located in the urban areas. So at first, we saw a lot of job losses coming out of the urban areas, and the rural areas were doing better. But now that we're have hit these now that people are beginning to be vaccinated and every consumer demand is back up, we see the growth over in the western half of the state. So number 2 is Kalispell. Number 1 is Bozeman, but they've been trading off back and forth for the last couple of months. I think Bozeman might remain in number 1, but they have been for a while. So, but Kalispell has been one of the areas where there's been the strongest job growth exiting the recession, followed by Helena, which is kind of weird. So I mentioned that this was a pretty rapid job growth exiting the recession. And this is a chart that we've been using to track this recession in comparison to all other recessions. And this is also on our job tracking dashboard that you can pull up if you want. So this looks at, this isn't very well labeled. Sorry, I keep forgetting to put better labels on this, and they end up not showing up on the chart for some reason. But the green one is the 2009 recession. So we had job losses in 2009 that were over 5%. And then we hit the bottom, and then it took a very, very, very long time for us to get back up to 100%. And 100% is the very top of this chart here. That was actually 46 months after recovery. I think we finally got up there. And then in comparison, look at this yellow line. That is the most recent pandemic recession. We actually had much, much deeper job losses, but look how quickly we were back up to just a couple points down. And then of course, again, once we had vaccinations come out this spring, it also quickly recovered this during the summer and fall. So looking at this chart, I think it's really important to think about, and I'll bring this up again later. If you are a business owner, maybe someone looking to produce trucks, for example, and you see this huge depth of a recession that we had last spring, and you're thinking about that it could look like this in 2009, like this in 2009. Can you guys see my mouse running around? Okay, so the point here is that there's a lot of businesses who thought the recession was going to look like this and not this sharp of a recovery. And that we'll get to supply chain issues in the next couple of slides.
Hey Barb, can I ask
yeah.
a quick question? What's the green one? I missed that. What's the green line?
The green line is the 2008 recession. It actually started in 2007 in December. So sorry, I always go back and forth between 2007, 2008, and 2009,
okay,
because you could hit all 3 of those. But on this chart, it's labeled the 2008 recession.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, and sorry, I will again try to get those labels to show up. Another interesting feature of this recession is that we've had very, very strong wage growth. And it's a little unusual how strong the wage growth has been. In fact, this chart kind of just looks at, on the blue line is the total wages paid in all payroll jobs in the whole state. So if we put everybody's paycheck into a big pot, how big is that pot getting? And that's on the left-hand axis here. So we had gains, we're right over 6 million this year. And we had gains of over 15% from the prior year. If we're looking at the average annual wage over the last 4 quarters, so this isn't the official average wage yet, because we only do that by 4 quarters in 1 year. But let's say we were going to do it, of going back 4 quarters from the last quarter of quarter 2, we would have an average annual wage of about $49,000. Just a short few years ago, we were talking about $46,000. So that's a pretty big increase in our average wage as well. Now, this chart is just to show you how much, I mean, the past chart shows you what the numbers are, but when I say it's very, very rapid growth, the last chart just didn't really show that very well. So this chart is basically designed to show you what the total wage growth was over the last year, and see how we're up here at 15% for total wage growth. That's crazy growth. And another thing, like past areas, we're only up here at like 10%, right? And in 2 quarters in the past year, we've been over 10%. So in the comparison to the historic data series here, very rapid job growth. Also, here's the average annual wage growth. See here in 2020, where it just starts on a different path of growth trajectory. And also to point out, back here in the 2009 recession, total wages actually declined. At no point did we have a decline over the year in total wages, even though we had such large job losses in the Q2 of last year. There was enough wage gains to actually accommodate for all of those lost jobs, which is really kind of mind-blowing for me. And it was for every single one of the people who forecast the state budget as well. It's kind of an impressive number for wage growth, and it helped solidify our budget for the state this year. Looking at Kalispell, we also have seen that similar job growth compared to our wage growth to the state, 14% total over the past year ending Q2. So that's really comparing 2020 Q2 to 2021 Q2. And yes, 2020 Q2 was quite low, but if you look at the Q4 to Q4, also still very, very rapid growth. In fact, I think it's like still at 14% for Kalispell. You also have had a 10% growth in your average annual wage. So that's even higher than what the average annual wage growth was at the state level as well. Imagine being employers out there trying to adjust to the current labor market, and it is just a whole different game than it was 2 years ago in terms of what you need to pay to recruit workers. So what does this mean to us? I'm going to admit another person. So Montana is running ahead of the US in terms of our employment recovery. And that has created some conversations for us because there's a lot of stimulus spending that's still happening throughout the US. And there is a good question, given how tight our labor markets are, whether or not that stimulus is really going to be effective in the Montana economy. Like, how are we going to find workers for the construction efforts? But it probably is needed in the rest of the US. And then also the economy overall just recovered much more quickly than expected. Suppliers have been lagging behind because their expectations were for a lot slower recovery. Overall, labor markets aren't great at moving quickly. So that has resulted in some, we call them labor market frictions. But just any sort of rapid change in the economy, it causes some tensions, including things like difficulty hiring or high unemployment, low unemployment. Like, we're just not good. Economies aren't good at rapidly changing. So one of the things that you see when an economy isn't good at rapidly changing is inflation. And you also see inflation when you are overstimulating your economy. So what causes the inflation? So let's go back just a little bit here. Inflation has been high over the year at 5.4%. The last time inflation was this high was actually exiting out of the 2009 recession. So it's not like we've never seen this level before. Back in the 80s, inflation was regularly in the double digits. So in historic terms, 5.4 isn't crazy large, but it certainly is much higher than what we've seen in the last few years, where inflation has hovered right around 2%. So there's a lot of questions going on nationally about exactly what the cause of this inflation is, because depending on the cause, then what, there's different things that we should be doing to address it. If the cause is too much stimulus, we probably should be pulling back those stimulus dollars. If it's due to unusually high wage gains, certainly, obviously that has been happening. Although there's plus sides to that as well. So the Federal Reserve typically just lets that go. And then if there's supply chain issues, the Federal Reserve Bank and the government typically don't have a lot to do with supply chain issues, because we let the private market work those out. But there's, according to, and of course, let's not forget that we still have a lot of issues going on with COVID. And that's what I want to show down here on the bottom of the chart. Globally, COVID cases have come down off of this fourth wave, but we're restarting another one. And then also the Western Pacific, where 1/3 of the goods sold in the entire world go through here, extremely high, peaking this fall. They are also have come down in recent months. But whereas the US has gotten vaccines out pretty quickly, and we have been able to return to work and producing in our factories, that's not necessarily true globally. And it's definitely not true in China, the Philippines, and Hong Kong, which either make at least one part of our goods or ship those goods through their ports. So that has been a real slowdown for our transportation systems and our supply chains. And as of right now, although the Federal Reserve Market Committee is meeting again this week, the Federal Reserve believes that most of the inflation can be attributed to COVID issues, which is why they have been relatively slowly pulling back on the stimulus. So that'll be an interesting thing coming up later this week. If you read about it, that's what the whole thing is about, is this inflation due to something that we can address, or is it because of COVID? And to be honest, if it's because of COVID, the Federal Reserve needs to continue to put on the gas. If it's because they're over and stimulating, they need to put on the brakes. So thankfully, we do not have that job. No one's going to like their answer. I'll tell you that much.
Hey, Barb.
Yes.
They don't call it to be an economist. I think you call the people who are, it's called the dismal science. So I can see your point here very well articulated.
Yeah. You're always telling people things they don't want to hear. That's why the governors always like me so much, right? They're going to kick me out. So the other thing that you see that are tough adjustments, signs that your economy had to change too quickly, is of course shortages in worker shortages, labor market tightness, or in the case of the huge crash last year, which also was too rapid, this huge spike in employment. This chart shows the employment levels. I know you all are very familiar with it, so I'm not going to reiterate too much other than pointing out that the US tends to be much higher than, has been a lot higher than the Montana rate coming down. So it's a different environment nationally than we're talking about here in the state. And then the Kalispell, this is actually for Flathead County, unemployment rate is also on this chart. It is not seasonally adjusted. So the most recent rate, I think, is 2.1 up in the Flathead. So the most recent unadjusted rate for Montana was 1.9. So so actually your Kalispell rate is roughly the same as the Montana state rate. So if we were to seasonally adjust your numbers up in the Flathead, we probably would see a glide path that's very similar to the states. So, and overall, there hasn't been a part of the state that has been left behind, really. Everywhere across the state, there's low unemployment rates now, except maybe they're a little high in the northwest corner up in Lincoln County. And then normally the reservation areas are pretty high, and they are higher than normal, higher than the states, but even the reservation areas are down around 6-7%. And then both the Flathead Reservation and the Fort Peck Reservation are down around 4.5%. So even reservation areas are starting to see a pretty much lower unemployment rates, although of course we always are excited to see better economic measures coming out of the reservation areas. And so this chart, a lot of people have been worried about the number of unemployment insurance claims. I'm just going to throw this out real quickly. The number of claims we have right now, much, much lower than we were in 2019. It was quite high during the pandemic, but our most recent week here, much lower than it was even in 2019, same week. Right now you have 562 unemployed people on unemployment insurance in the Flathead. And that is also lower than the level was in 2019. Just so you know, you can look up this number at any time, but there was about 162 million paid out in unemployment insurance benefits to Flathead County during the pandemic. That's available on our job tracking dashboard. So not every person who's unemployed in Montana is on unemployment insurance. And so the number of unemployed people but not necessarily on unemployment insurance, is 18,100 in the most recent month. We haven't had that few of people unemployed since 2007. And just think of the population growth since then. Moral of this story is everybody keeps asking me, where are the workers? And I keep telling them they're employed. Our number of people employed has never been higher. Number of unemployed, very, very low. So we also have some concerns about labor force participation, which we'll talk about in just a couple slides, but let me talk about this real quick. Job openings, very, very high, including in Flathead County. You can look at the trends again on the job tracking dashboard. You see a lot of quits, news about the quits, and we're actually, our EAG tomorrow is coming out about the quit levels. When we have a lot of people who are moving around from job to job, that's actually really good for our economy overall. People quitting their job and moving into another job. That helps our productivity levels a lot, and that is very good. That means we can make more stuff with fewer people. So overall, the number of like quits is in the long term a good thing. But right now we're having a lot more job postings, which is the green line, than there are hires. And that does indicate that we're having worker shortages. So you can see that has really happened in the last year and a half. So this is the part that's like confusing for people sometimes. One of the metrics we utilize when we're talking about the economy is labor force participation. And that's what this chart shows here. So while I say all of the people out that want to work out in the state of Montana either are employed and very, very few are unemployed, there are still a lot of people who have chosen to leave the labor force, which means they have chosen to not actively seek out work in the last year. In the last year, the Montana, and that has happened both in the state and in the nation, the decline for the state is about 1.3% labor force participation rate decline. That translates to about 11,000 workers. So this is a substantial thing for our growth in the future. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. So what do we mean by that number? The labor force, this is the way we calculate it. We take everybody in the whole state, and that is the total population of Montana is 1.08 million. And then we take out the people who are not eligible for work. So people in prisons, in the military, and also people under 16. There are people under 16 that work in Montana, but they're not fully able to work like a 40-hour work week. So we take those folks out. That leaves us with 800, I'm going to just not read that number. You guys can read it for yourself. But really the number, the percentage of the population that we take out there, just taking out the people under 16 and in the military or institutionalized, that's roughly 20% of the overall population. So we're already down to just 80% of our population just by taking out people who legally cannot work. So then what's left over is our civilian population. We divide that civilian population into three groups: employed, unemployed, and then out of the labor force, which basically means they did not actively look for work in this most current month. So let's do that. Slice up the state again. And we've got the employed population is roughly 61% of the civilian population over 16. That's 532 people. As I said, that is more than we've ever had before in that category. That does include the self-employed, business owners, ranchers, independent contractors, payroll workers, anybody who gets a paycheck or is working for pay falls in that category. Then we have the two other categories, the percent unemployed, and when you take them as a percentage of the overall population and of the civilian population, they're a little less than 1% of the total population of the state. So very few unemployed people actively seeking work. And then we've got those who are not in the labor force, and that's 38% of our population over 16. So when I say that most of the workers are working, what I'm saying is we either have them working or there's not very many people in this unemployed category. But we still have this category, not in the labor force. that we're really interested in. However, it's also important to remember that people move in and out of these categories a lot. There's very few people who, who are unemployed the full year, and there's lots of Montanans that move in and out of employment, out of the labor force and back to unemployed. So we still have the availability. If we were able to capture those people into more permanent work solutions, we could find a lot more work hours. But it's important to realize this is a constantly fluctuating thing. In fact, just in the quarter two, and I'm using 2019 numbers here so it's not affected by the pandemic, even before the pandemic in the second quarter of 2019, there's about 70,000 new hires and about 52,000 separations. That's how much in and outs we have. And you guys in the job service office see that very frequently of people moving in and out of employment, unemployment. So when we're talking about the section of Montana who are not in the labor force, that includes people who are not working for pay. So if you're taking care of your family at home or doing any nonprofit work not for pay, you would fit into this category. And then also, let's say, you're a construction worker and it's the end of the season and you're not looking for work for a month, and then you might go back to doing some seasonal work in the winter, but you're not working for work right now, you would also be considered not in the labor force that month. So who are the rest of the people here? And mostly they're retired. So that's one of the challenges we have, is that there's a lot of people in this category and we could tap into them, but how much are you going to get someone who wants to be retired to be back into the labor force? Now, fundamentally, that means that our worker shortage is fundamentally caused by our aging demographics. This chart is in the Labor Day report, so I'm not going to talk about it very much because it takes too long. But long story short is this blue portion shows Montana's population by age, and the orange shows the labor force. And once people get to be older, they are less likely to participate in the labor force. And also in Montana, we have a lot of people in this category. That is fundamentally what's the cause. However, during the pandemic, again, we had this big drop. We're still looking for these workers, which are about 11,000 workers, to come back in the labor force. So that's the big question right now, is how can we seek out those workers and get them back in the labor force? Nationally and within the state, caretakers make up at least a quarter, if not more, of this decline. That's moms and dads. And it turns out that college educated moms are actually very impacted, particularly those who ended up having to work at home, because it turns out it's pretty impossible to work from home while your kids are also there. So there was pretty high rates of dropout among that particular demographic. And there's lots of research going on more about that. Looking at the most recent month of data, here's all your categories of who's not working. And again, retired is the biggest category. And then, well, we don't have any idea about these 89,000 because they didn't answer our questions in the survey. A lot of people who are long-term sick or disabled. I have another chart about that real quickly. And then, some people actually just lost their jobs, but not very many. One that's very higher than the pandemic is, of course, he's caring with somebody with COVID or concerned about COVID. So COVID is still keeping workers out of the labor market. And remember, these are people who are not interested in working at all. So they're not looking for jobs. Obviously, that wasn't around before the pandemic. It's higher. Caring for children or the elderly has definitely increased during the pandemic. And then this category of didn't want to be employed is kind of an interesting one. This did increase during the pandemic up to about 6% of the total out of the labor force. And normally it's about 3%. It's now back down to about 4% of the population. I have one of my economists, Emily, taking a closer look at that group. And I think we might be engaging in that a little bit further as job service offices in the future. We'll see if we find anything interesting and usable. One thing to mention about the people with disability or illnesses, there's a lot of individuals with disabilities that are not in the labor force, and also they have higher than normal rates of unemployment. So that is one group where we could probably find more workers and get them into the labor force. I wanted to point out this slide. The interesting part of this is just in this last year of data in 2020 and 2021, there was a dip of people who weren't in the labor force and a corresponding increase of labor force participation rates among disabled people during when most people were going remote. So there's a lot of research going on right now looking at this a little bit further, but they think that having more availability of remote work really brought a lot of disabled people into the labor force because they were able to stay in their own homes where they already have accommodations. And so if we want to draw more disabled individuals into the labor force, we probably could look at that as an option. This is an interesting category. Love data that you don't ever play with before. There's new data for us to play with. And that's the number of people in Montana that are out of the labor force because they're concerned about COVID or they're sick with COVID or had to quarantine because their partner had COVID, whatever it was. So here's our new COVID cases in Montana in the black. The concerned about COVID hit a peak last December at 31,000. You know, that was kind of our one of our peaks for cases with the Delta variant. And then people started to get vaccinated. And as vaccinations got more prevalent, that number has calmed down. However, now the caring for someone who's sick with COVID has started to increase again with our case counts. I will say this is very difficult for businesses to accommodate. I think businesses are probably over hiring right now so that they can fill in the gaps from people who are homesick or have to quarantine. Like you need just a couple extra people to fill in for sick leave right now. That's probably also contributing to the high level of job postings. I also want to mention that I think this issue also impacts our partly retired workforce a lot. Montana does have a lot of people who are over the age of 16 who work in part-time jobs. A lot of them are not necessarily, you know, career oriented. They're more like, you know, greeter at Walmart, you know, at the camp, the guy that checks you in at the campgrounds, camp host. And, you know, just to give them something to do, it might be related to a passion of theirs, but and they're typically low wage. So if you're in this category of Montanans who were at high risk of having COVID complications versus your low wage job, it seems like a pretty easy economic decision to step out of the labor market. So I think that probably explains a lot of those. Here's the chart. I think you guys have probably seen this in one of our publications before. This is the number of parents who are working reduced work hours because of the pandemic. There's also, in addition to the 60,000 or so parents working reduced work hours, about 16,000, nearly 17,000 who aren't working at all because of the pandemic. So that's overall about 70,000 people that we could tap into for more workers. And then lastly, we do have a lot of solutions that we could be pursuing. I think some of you guys are probably pretty aware and have heard these solutions before. Probably the new one is remote work has become a much bigger issue in the last year, obviously. Well, it turns out that we actually saw a large amount of labor productivity gains because of the large amount of remote work. That has mostly disappeared now that workers have moved back to the office. But because we saw such greater productivity, like the money's on the wall, and we'll probably see a lot of companies move back into remote work in the future just because they saved so much money doing it. So I would anticipate that still being on the table, you know, in the future, particularly for a national company. And then just the last slide of my presentations are always you know, the advertising for our publications, and that's out on our website. And then also I've mentioned the job tracking dashboard. We do have this finding workers tab on our job tracking dashboard, and every single month we update it with particularly like the percentage of people who are out of the labor force because of kids, stuff like that. Some interesting things going on. We're seeing more retirements just in the last few months. we've actually been seeing the labor force participation rate of fathers dropping significantly. So those are things we're keeping an eye on, and you can too if you want to. And that is all of that I have. I'd love to answer any questions that you have.
Hey,
That
Barb.
was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it really was. Barb, this is Kathy. I was just wondering about you talked a little bit about both the increase in remote work or the availability of remote work and that bringing more disabled people, logically bringing more disabled people into the workforce. And just also the productivity issues associated with that. I think there's a really high level of, ignorance sounds like a strong word, but I think a lot of employers don't recognize that. And you did mention there that there's more research being done about the disabled. Are we going to be getting that information really in a form that we can try to educate people better? I think there's maybe a perception that people, when they're working remotely, are maybe doing other things in the house. I don't know, what it is, but that seems to be a missed opportunity there.
I completely agree. I do worry about that. Compared to other states, Montana employers were less likely to send people home for remote work than nearly every other state. We're definitely in the bottom 10. So it's actually true that a lot of our employers didn't even see that then. But and there has been a huge national conversation about that, right? But I think there's a really great article that was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research recently that was basically saying, in the end, employers are going to follow the money. Now, it is true that I think that there's a lot of political opinions that might be changing that discussion. I do think, like the Harvard Business Review came out and said, they had concerns about remote work because it does tend to like have different impacts on different worker groups. However, that research was done prior to the pandemic, not during the pandemic. So I think that that's going to be revised, but it's always the case that any academic research is about a year and a half, maybe 2 years behind when you really need it, right? But I do think that we're going to continue to see that as a trend. And I think particularly for national employers and Montana employers are just going to have to be in many ways forced to adapt to that, because where are you going to find your employees? And I right now could work from my house, and in fact today I am working from my house. It's a lot quieter than the office when you give presentations, and I could work for any employer in the entire United States. So like, where are our Montana employers going to find people? Well, maybe they're going to find people up in the Flathead. Maybe they're going to find people on the reservation. And to tap into that workforce who wants to remain pretty place-based, they're going to have to adopt policies to do that. So it is an interesting thing. And I completely agree with you that I think the conversation has kind of gotten a little weird. It became political instead of economic in nature. But in the end of the day, people follow their economic incentives. It just might take them a while to get there.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
No other questions. Wow. Okay, Jody.
All of our questions, Barb.
I know, I was gonna say, I could probably
Very
throw one out too. Go for it, Jody.
All right. I guess I was thinking about the wage increase, and assuming that that's purely supply and demand, that employers are kind of being forced to increase their wages. Are there any other factors? Is that the primary one?
So yes, I mean, so first of all, wages tend to be pretty sticky, which, some people are like, oh, are wages going to go down? No, wages never go down. Wages always go up. Wages for particular occupations might go down. For example, you see the hiring of people going at $15 an hour for food service workers. They do tend to go back down to 12 eventually, right? But they never go back down. We haven't had a lot of employers paying minimum wage for a very long time. There's another question I've been getting on wages that are basically like, is inflation driving the wage gains. And in fact, it should be the opposite, that you think about that. Wages drive inflation. Inflation doesn't necessarily drive wages, although a lot of employers do automatically adjust for inflation, and that causes. But I would argue technically those wages should have been like constantly increasing if it was an active market that people are moving in and out of. But when you think about it, a business's cost, about 60% of the costs of any business are involved in labor. And so if that's going up, it's going to make the employer drive up their prices to afford the wages, and that's going to cause inflation. So far, for the last 2 years, we are running way ahead wage growth versus inflation. That's called real wage growth. It's very, very good. It suggests it makes us better off as a state, and it drives future demand. So all of that is very, very good. There have been a couple months this summer where like our 1 month gain in wages was less than the inflation, but overall, we're still running way ahead of inflation for wage gains.
Thank you.
Okay, next up.
Okay, I've got another question. Could we talk a little bit about what goes into that unemployment rate? Just real briefly, because it's,
You mean
when
like data sources?
yeah, and what it actually means, because I think when you hear the term unemployment rate, you think, well, I should be able to use this percentage to generate a number of people based on the population or whoever's in the labor force. And it's not exactly that.
Well, no, it's not exactly that, but part of that is like, because like how we divide up the population, the unemployment rate that we publish is the number of people who are unemployed as a percentage of the labor force. So those are those two categories of employed and unemployed. That's it. Like people who are actively seeking work or currently employed, how many of them are unemployed? Now, the why would we do such a thing, right? Like, why don't we just do it of the whole population? Well, the unemployment rate is a measure of how hard it is to get a job if you're looking for a job. It's actually a metric used to measure the health of your labor market. So if we include people like retired people, for example, who aren't actively looking for the jobs, that wouldn't really, that would just tell us that our population's getting old, right? That's what our labor force participation rate tells us. So I think the issue here is that everyone thinks the unemployment rate is the only statistic to pay attention to. It's an important statistic, but it's not the only one that we use to talk about the economy. But it's also true that it is also a very all-encompassing. You know that when an unemployment rate is at 3.1% or roughly around 2% unadjusted, that is a very low unemployment rate. You know that it's difficult to find workers. You know that there's probably not a lot of people coming in from outside the labor force, so that we're in a worker shortage. You know that wages are increasing a lot in that scenario. Now, probably the common man does not know this, but the Economist sees that number and is like, that's what that all that means. So, but the real reason we do it is because it is not supposed to measure how much of your population is working. We have a whole different thing for that. It measures how easy it is to get a job if you're looking for a job.
Thank you.
That's great insight. I think that's helpful for all of us to hear for sure.
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And it does, it's one of the first things, like I said, I teach at Great Falls College, and it's one of the first things that they got to learn in their macroeconomics classes is that. And there's all sorts of measures that we use. I would say like any given week, I look at probably 100 different economic measures to make sure things are moving in the right direction. So that's the unemployment rate's just one that, I guess we've adopted, and it is for the most part easy to understand. In terms of data sources, we mostly get that data from calling people, and that's done federally by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We also have a survey called the Current Employment Statistics, which I'm sure you've heard about from Matt Betcher or Mike Puri. And that's also in our press release every month. So we take data from that and merge it in as well. And then we also take data from unemployment insurance claims as also a data source. And then that does it every single month. We put it into this big statistical model. And then every quarter we update benchmark to actual employment statistics from the QCEW. And then at the end of each year, we adjust for population controls and additional data that we've gotten throughout the year. It's a long process. The book to explain it is about this thick.
Great job condensing.
I actually sometimes have to explain it all to the legislature. And one of my favorite jokes to make is that I put the entire formula up on the slide and just be like, well, here it is. Done.